Let's talk about a huge contradiction. What if a country gave every single person the right to vote, but in the real world, in day-to-day life, millions of its citizens were treated as less than human? This was the dangerous paradox that kept Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, one of the main architects of the Indian Constitution, up at night. And it forced him to completely rethink what democracy really means.
This quote, man, it gets right to the heart of his entire philosophy. For Ambedkar, India was basically being built on a political fault line. On one hand, you have this beautiful promise of democracy, but deep underneath, you have the crushing reality of social inequality. He warned everyone that this wasn't just a small problem. It was a ticking time bomb that could tear the whole new nation apart.
All right, so let's dig into that problem. What actually happens when you try to lay the blueprint for a democracy on top of a society that is, at its core, completely undemocratic? I mean, this is the question a lot of people just took for granted, right? The idea of every adult getting a vote was revolutionary. But Ambedkar asked a much tougher question. What good is one vote in a ballot box if, outside that box, society says you have no value at all? He saw India's ancient caste system as, well, a direct poison to democracy. You can't just hand someone a ballot and say, there, you're equal now, when the second they leave the voting booth, they're denied basic human dignity. It's like trying to build a massive skyscraper on top of quicksand. It might look stable for a little while, but sooner or later, the whole thing is going to collapse.
So, what was his big idea? His solution? Well, it wasn't to give up on democracy. Not at all. It was to make it bigger, deeper, to give it real roots. He came up with this much more complete, kind of three-dimensional vision of what a real democracy has to be. And at the very heart of his solution is this idea of social democracy. Now, for Ambedkar, this wasn't just about a type of government or a bunch of laws. No, he saw true democracy as a way of life, something that had to be practiced in our families, in our neighborhoods, in every single social interaction we have. He argued that these three things, political, social, and economic democracy, were not separate items on a checklist. They were totally intertwined. Think of it like three strands woven together to make a single, super strong rope. If you try to pull one strand out, the whole rope just falls apart.
Okay, let's break this down a bit. You've got political democracy. That's the whole one person, one vote thing. That's kind of the skeleton of the system. But a skeleton needs flesh and blood to live, right? That's social democracy, which makes sure we actually treat each other as equals. And then there's economic democracy, one person, one value, which is all about stopping huge gaps in wealth from giving a few people way more power than everyone else. You see how if one is missing, the whole thing feels pretty weak. And this quote just nails it. Liberty, equality, and fraternity, they aren't things you can pick and choose from like a menu. You can't really have liberty if people aren't equal, and you can't have equality if there's no sense of fraternity or brotherhood. For him, trying to separate them defeats the whole point of even having a democracy in the first place. Okay, so if democracy is this way of life, you can't just flip a switch and have it, right? It has to be nurtured. It needs the right conditions to actually grow. And Ambedkar was super clear about what that fertile ground needed to look like. He basically asked this very question, and his answer was simple. A constitution and some elections are not enough, not even close. The very fabric of society itself has to be democratic for the system to have any real shot at working. So here's what he said was absolutely necessary. And notice how this list goes way beyond just laws and government. Of course, you need things like no glaring inequalities, and you have to prevent the tyranny of the majority. But look at the other stuff. Constitutional morality, that's a deep-seated respect for the rules of the game even when you lose, and a strong public conscience where people actually feel a responsibility to stand up for the rights of others. Without that stuff, the rules are just words on a piece of paper. All right, let's bring this all together. How does all this connect to his economic ideas, and why is it still so relevant to us today? So, to get to that economic democracy we talked about, Ambedkar pushed for a model he called state socialism. Now, this wasn't about the government owning everything. It was about the state stepping in to control key industries and agriculture to make sure economic benefits were shared by everyone, not just hoarded by a few at the top. For him, it was a crucial check on the power of private wealth, which he knew could easily undermine democracy. But, and this is a really key point, his vision was not the same as traditional Marxism. The biggest difference was how to create change. Ambedkar completely rejected violent revolution.
He was all in on parliamentary democracy and changing things through constitutional methods. He saw the state not as an enemy to be torn down, but as a tool that could be used to achieve justice. And for him, social and political freedoms were every bit as important as economic reforms.
And where can you see his biggest impact? Well, it's woven right into the DNA of the Indian Constitution. While not all of his economic ideas made it in, his powerful vision for social and economic justice became the guiding light for the directive principles of state policy, basically the moral compass for how the country should be run.
And that leaves us with this huge, lingering question, doesn't it? Ambedkar's analysis of that deep tension between our political ideals and our social reality, it's still incredibly relevant, not just in India, but all over the world. His call for a democracy based not just on votes, but on values, is a challenge that's still ringing in our ears today. How far have we really come in building societies where liberty, equality, and fraternity are a real, lived experience for every single person?